After working several search and rescue missions, I can tell you some pretty crazy horror stories about some of my own terrors that I've witnessed. Myself, along with 2 other friends, were out searching for a lost hiker. We got a call from dispatch saying they finally found him, although now he was deceased. We began heading back to the station when our boss gave us yet another call, claiming there was an emergency on the mountain about 3 miles west of us. So, me and my buddies hopped on an all-terrain vehicle, also known as ATVs for you uneducated. We sped over there as quick as possible. When we had arrived, the scene was unlike anything I've ever seen. We found the 2 men dead. They looked like they were in their mid-30s, both of them completely drained of all their blood. There was no blood anywhere to be found, not even the slightest spatter. The bodies lay there with gaping wounds they had clearly bled out from. Not only was all their blood gone, but all their fluids as well. They had become nearly dried up husks of what they were. There were no trace of any bodily fluids on the ground, or by their body. There was no blood marks or anything on their bodies, and they looked rather recently deceased. Within the last 12 hours, it was determined. After noticing puncture wounds on their necks, it became clear that these men were killed by some sort of wannabe vampires or potentially a vampire cult. Of course, this sounds crazy, and after doing some more research, I realized there have been a string of murders within the same MO all around the world. In every single case, victims had been murdered in cold blood, completely drained of all their fluids. Obviously, this also goes hand in hand with many alien abductions, as well as cattle mutilations. This is not just some quinky-dink either. They always happen near a large body of water, or in the deep woods. Most people, or in this case, these victims, will go missing at night, and they come back during the day. We really might as well be dealing with a vampire cult here, who could potentially be extremely dangerous. None of us could really believe what we were dealing with. The sheer absurdity from it is what made it scary. One of my close friends suggested we do some more research, so I tried to do some more digging and learned a bit about vampirism in detail. And after doing some more reading on the mythology, this is when I realized there are many cults mimicking the way a vampire would kill. However, the manner in which these gentlemen were killed still doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The lack of blood anywhere had baffled me. I wasn't really sure what to make of all of it, if we're honest. After forensics had a pretty deep look, I found out that both gentlemen were killed around the same time, within 10 minutes of each other. Another thing that I found interesting is that these guys both knew each other. They were lovers, apparently. I have a hard time believing that these 2 awkward-looking gentlemen would have been a part of any cult. However, it's possible they could have been the victims of a random cult killing, possibly a satanic ritual or sacrifice. Another run we had was in the Colorado wilderness. An older woman had become lost and was missing for 2 days total. We searched easily 10 miles from the direction she was last seen. We found nothing. We called off the search, heading back. During our trip, we came across a small tent in the middle of nowhere. A bunch of food, drinks and water and supplies. We thought it was strange to see a tent with nobody in sight, only to find the campsite abandoned. It was inconclusive if there was ever any evidence to her living or staying in it for any amount of time. Fast forward about 5 months after, it's now early fall, about 20 plus miles away from where she had been last seen on that cool March afternoon. Half of her skull was found, her right hiking boot, and a torn piece of backpack with small snippets of blood on it. After testing the DNA, it appeared the skull fragment, blood, and the shoe all belonged to the same older woman. They were all found within about a 60-foot radius of each other in a small meadow near a larger creek. The rest of her remains were never found. The lack of reasonable explanation for these cases is what really baffles me. We had found the woman's skull, her shoe, and a piece of her backpack near a creek, but have no way to tell how it got there, We had searched the area where she was last seen for days and found nothing. It's hard to believe that she could have gotten there on foot. Maybe they were all abducted or something. Might be plausible, but I still find it strange that we never found a clue as to what happened. We had consulted with professionals. They agreed that not only is this simply unexplainable, but also considerably disturbing. They could not believe their luck, however. They too came up short in providing us with ample answers or solutions. We took a heavy break from the case, as it weighed heavy on our minds and spirits. But it didn't stop here. We had a middle-aged gentleman, Michael Uravau, go missing under mysterious circumstances. Around noon, his wife had saw him leave to go use the restroom, but never returned. Michael Uravau, 59, disappeared around noon on September 11th. He went to use the restroom and never came back. After extensive searching, nothing was found. However, 2 weeks later, all of his clothes that he was wearing on the day of his disappearance were found in a pile, as if he had somehow stripped. They were completely clean. Having been missing for 2 days, and having not any speck of dirt or being tattered in any way is unexplainable as well. About a month after, roughly 25 days, 7 miles away from where he was last seen, 4 miles from the highway, and 3 away from what seems like a running path, his remains were discovered. As much as I wanted to find him alive, I knew that's not what we would find. We called it off as soon as we saw him laying lifeless on the ground, next to an old oak tree. The cause of death was asphyxiation. The man had been hung by a rope that was wrapped around his neck. He also had deep cuts on his wrist. There were no other signs of any damage that had occurred to his body. We found him in such a state that we knew he had been dead for at least a week. He was also wearing white robes when we found him, and the rope that was used to hang him was also gone. The entire circumstances in which finding his body was very, very strange. Anyhow, if I get more time, I'll gladly share some more stories. For now, I'm sorry that this is all you're getting. I will follow up with you soon. Thank you. While not exactly a park ranger, I've been working alongside the Forest Service industry now for years. I wanted to come forward with my own stories to share with you. A few years back, I was working closely with a team in the deep woods of eastern Oregon. We had been working for days and nights on end, clearing overgrown trails and keeping them maintained for loggers and hikers alike. And this is when we began experiencing strange things that we've never would have expected. While we were clearing one trail, we saw something large running through the forest towards us in our direction. It was large, moving unusually fast. Considering how dense the brush was, it should have been impossible. At first, I thought it to be a bear, but its gait wasn't right for any animal that I knew. Much more like a man, but moving far too quickly to be one. It did not take long before everybody started calling it Old Three Toes, because of the way its heel protruded from its foot. That's not something you can fake. My team began telling everybody who worked for our company that Old Three Toes was out there somewhere. Well, the next morning, while we're all eating breakfast, somebody noticed some strange tracks in the mud alongside one of our trails. All of us gathered around to examine them. They had 3 toes, with unusually long nails and claw marks, unlike any animal I'd ever seen. I'm no tracker, but I know enough about animals to say that this wasn't an animal print. It had been indeed made by a man. We had heard stories for years about how people had lost their dogs upon these forest roads. Something would chase them until they could not run anymore and take them. At first, we had a hard time believing all this, but something was out there. We just knew it. It walked through the forest like a man, but operated and functioned like an animal. Now, I've shared this story multiple times. Even though we've only saw it once, I hope it had not seen us. I share this story to try and bring some attention to people about the things that go bump in the woods. Sometimes, it's said that you can hear his long nails scraping against the tree trunks at night. In fact, one of my close friends, who's worked as a ranger for 12 years, told me about his own personal experience, where he explained something very similar to what I just told you. It was about 3 years ago now. I was out on my own, patrolling one of the trails. As I'm walking down this empty path, I could hear something very large approaching. I first spotted Old Three Toes as I walked down the trail. I thought it was a bear, but its stride wasn't right, and it had only 3 toes on its feet that I could see. Feet that looked similar to like a large ostrich. When we heard the strange prints, we had gathered around to examine them. They had 3 long, oddly shaped toes with very long claws. It looked like they had been clawing something recently, as there were deep gouges in the earth. None of us knew what it was, but at the least, there was something large stalking us through those woods. I can't even go now without hearing the sounds of it. The scariest part is that I know it's there, waiting for somebody to make a mistake, and surely it'll snatch up somebody. Now, I don't think it's a Bigfoot. I've never seen any evidence of these things' presence. But Old Three Toes, that's a different story. I know it's around. I've heard the nails clicking on tree bark before, as it gets close. While I've only seen it once, I'm very aware that it's out there, waiting for the right moment to show itself. I think that people should be very aware of these things' existence. You may have seen something similar in legends or campfire stories, but I assure you, after experiencing what we did, nothing will be all the more terrifying. Search and rescue is a very important piece of the emergency management puzzle. It's oftentimes much overlooked, but it is a very thorough, integral part of the entire process. One thing that search and rescue offers that other components don't is humans first. A little bit of background on me. I'm a self-professed paranormal junkie. I've got a library of bookshelves of manila folders, bursting with handouts and hauntings, Bigfoots, UFOs, cryptids, everything you could need. And long story short, I also worked as a ranger a long time ago, back in the late 80s and early 90s. For this presentation, I dug up several bits of info of search and rescue missions that I had personally worked on. The first is this woman, Kaylee Copley, whose real name will remain withheld. She was a 26-year-old woman who was visiting Hot Springs National Park. The last time her family saw her was when they visited the national park on August 15th. Her family had reported her missing that same day. She was last seen at approximately 4:30 p.m. on the 15th at their remote campsite. Her car was also found near the site, but she was nowhere to be found. After extensive searching, her body was located eventually 28 miles away from the campsite on a lone remote road. The search for Kaylee was massive, involving hundreds of volunteers from every walk of life imaginable. The search party covered a 15-mile radius from the campsite on foot and horseback, while aerial searches were conducted by fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters. The searches that were also cross-referenced with Hot Springs PD records of registered sex offenders, all of whom who live within a 15-mile radius of the park. They too were all unsuccessful. The party was certain that Kaylee was not found in the park itself, as they had been checking every inch. Now, a pair of hunters, during their annual trip to the national forest, discovered her remains. Kaylee's body had been with her right arm missing, and most of her vital organs missing. Her body, for the most part, was completely untouched by nature, other than a few things, which I'll get to. At the time of finding, she had been dead for roughly 48 to 72 hours. The search party and everybody involved was very perplexed. They had gone over every inch of the park, finding no evidence whatsoever. Yet, here's Kaylee's body, dumped in an area that seemed purposefully left untouched by nature. Which only leads us to one thing: she had to have been abducted. There's no way somebody could have casually kidnapped her and then dumped her body all this time later without ever knowing. But it's not all that simple. Another peculiar piece of evidence is that her body was untouched by wildlife. Even though she had been dead for at least 48 hours, her body should have been at least touched by a predator, scavenger, or other animal. There were no signs of flies or any decay settling in. The damage to her body may have possibly been a result of ritualistic killing. There are indications that she might have been the victim of a satanic ritual, that her organs were harvested after she was dead. Significant amounts of damage had been done to Kaylee's body, which would have already been done after she was dead. But the damage was primarily on her lower back and rectum. Severe bruising and swelling, indicating a fall landing on her backside. However, none of that explains her vital organs missing, as there were no incision marks anywhere on her body. The death of this woman is very mysterious. It's unclear why her organs were removed, and or how they were removed without ever having cutting her open. There are many questions that cannot be answered. There's not near enough evidence to give an answer, as many questions have been raised. All we have is a body, and no way to tell how, who, what, when, or where. Another young man, Dennis Howe, also not his real name. Dennis, also 19 years old, was out on a hunting trip in the Ohio River Valley when he had first disappeared. He had ventured out Friday to go hunting, but never returned home. His last known location was in southern Indiana, and a search party with Dennis's family found his car in the parking lot Friday at 8 p.m. after they searched thoroughly all throughout Friday. His hunting supplies were still inside the car, but nobody ever saw Dennis. There was no trace of him anywhere near his vehicle, at all, or near the property. The search party discovered this strange thing about Dennis's disappearance. There were no signs of foul play at all, which was odd. It would be unlikely that somebody who knew how to hunt would properly leave their equipment behind, vanishing without a trace. After all, even though Dennis was only 19, he was very well versed in the outdoors, according to his family. A large search party of at least 50 people was scouring the entire adjacent area. Nobody can find traces of him. The only theory we have is he was possibly abducted, although no signs of kidnapping were left. A search party also discovered something else strange about the location. There is no indication that Dennis ever entered the forest. Even though his car was found and the trailhead to go into the forest was clear, there should have been marks from his tires, footprints, since much of the mud around his vehicle was very wet that day. It appeared he had not even got out of his vehicle. He could have gone a few hundred feet into the woods, but there's no evidence of it. There's not any evidence that he had left his car. The only thing we know is that he had vanished without a trace over the weekend. No signs of foul play, and there's no way he could have entered without leaving evidence. About a year later, a molar and 6 teeth were found. It was discovered that the teeth were actually linked to Dennis, and they did belong to 19-year-old Dennis. The teeth had been another result of an extensive search. They were found in the woods, deep, about 2 miles away from where Dennis's car was. Nobody knows how or why his teeth were the only thing that showed up, and why they showed up. It's hard to know how or why Dennis completely vanished without a trace. His body was never recovered, and the only remains found were his teeth, which were found about 2 miles away. Still, we don't know how or why they ended up in the location they did, and it's a mystery. While dark things do happen, we're not exactly sure what is causing the multitude of paranormal-like disappearances for these young people, and it remains a large mystery to this day. Not my own story, but I would like to tell you about a family member who had worked as a ranger for years. They very much believe in Bigfoot, and have had their own experiences while working in the national parks from Minnesota, all the way up north to New York. Here are his experiences, which he had the pleasure of typing up and sending to me. I once had an amazing experience while working in the forest ranger office of a national park in Minnesota. I was there for a couple of days, and it was late at night. We were out doing our rounds as usual, and we saw some lights up on the hill near the lookout tower. At first, they looked like they might be a large deer, possibly. However, after looking again, we could see that it was indeed two large eyes, like we had suspected, but they were larger than what we had originally thought. They were almost glowing an orange-red, no pupils or whites to them. We had all alerted each other and went to investigate the area more closely. We did not see any other movement or anything else outside the eyes. Upon further inspection, we also realized that the eyes were not in the direction of the tower. Instead, seemed to be in a direct line with us. As we drove closer, these eyes turned toward us, running into a clearing that was a little bit more open. And this was when we saw it for the first time. A massive creature, standing about 9 to 10 feet tall, a large frame built like a house, leaning down kind of hunched over, as if it had scoliosis. We described it as almost gorilla-looking, especially with the proportion of legs, but far more muscular than an average human. It also had very long hair covering most of its body, including the face. The only part we could clearly see were its glowing red eyes. We all took a step back, deciding to leave quickly. This thing moved very swiftly, and just as we did, it ran away from us. Once we left, and there was safe enough distance, we radioed our station back to let them know what was going on. The next day, we decided to visit the same area and see that there were no trails coming off or from the road. There was no evidence of any activity during the night. The ground around the area in which we saw it was very soft. Surely, there would have been a track or two. But after scouting for about 2.5 hours, we found nothing. The second time was when I was up in New York State, working at Letchworth State Park. While I was on duty, I saw something large following me in the trees. It reminded me of a very large hairy man. Immediately, it became very dark, and I began to feel as if somebody was watching me, as well as my partner. We had both become incredibly nervous. We now left our post and started heading back to the vehicle. Unfortunately, I had left my flashlight with my partner so he could get ahead of me in finding our way back. As soon as we began making our way, I heard a small noise and turned. I couldn't see anything, but felt this immense pressure in my gut, like something was about to happen. Right after, I heard my partner shout and then start running towards me. It didn't take long for him to get to me. We began running towards the car. We didn't look back, and we could hear branches breaking in the woods, telling us that whatever this was something not a human. It was pissed and was now chasing us. We made our way back to the car, and we were able to get in and leave. It seemed like it took hours, but at most, from the time we exited our vehicle to going down the trail to encountering it and going back, was at most 10 minutes. That was by far the most intense experience I had while working. But I also have a story to share with you from a friend who was working in the Adirondacks. The incident took place on a trail that is fairly remote. Not too many people go out on it. He was working alone, and he approached a bend in the trail. He noticed something large standing right next to the trail itself. He wasn't sure what it was at first, but as he got closer and made his way around the bend, he saw that there was a very large figure hunched over on the trail itself. From behind, he described it as large, tall, and almost gorilla-looking in nature, until it turned around, and he realized the face was far more human than he had ever imagined. The nose and bridge were very much like a man, with a very strong brow ridge and a pointed head. He told me that it reminded him of the movie Coneheads, that same shape but not as exaggerated of a cone shape. It also had no neck, and was built like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime in the 1980s. It gave him a very stern look, and its eyes were black. The feeling he got was that he was not supposed to see it. He quickly turned back the way he came, going back to his station where he waited for another ranger to show back up. I have asked several people who work in these parks about these things, and they all have at least one experience with these creatures. We're kind of not allowed to talk about it. It seems as though these creatures are not usually aggressive, but at times they can be, while other times they almost appear curious and interested in humans. Okay, my personal last encounter for now. Fast forward. This was in 1999, the last time I'd encountered one of these creatures. I was working in one of the parks. This was also just outside of Yosemite. I was not alone. There were 2 other rangers with me, and we had all seen them before. The first time they had showed themselves to us, and it was at nighttime. They seemed to be interested in our activity. The ranger who had dealt with them previously described them as very territorial and aggressive, and resembled your stereotypical Bigfoots. At this point, I had already had the previous 2 other encounters, so I wasn't really wanting to share that information, just in case I was crazy, or they thought I was crazy. They appeared to be outside and waiting for us to make a move. The second time was during the day when we were out on patrol. They appeared to come out of nowhere, but seemed like they were very tactical, staying hidden behind the trees, waiting for us to show ourselves. We're not sure what they were planning, but they never made their move. We think they are very intelligent, but felt that maybe, for them, they were planning to attack, but the situation wasn't right. Just my thoughts, of course.